Good afternoon. My name is Rebecca Moreira, and I'm an environmental health specialist. I'd like to thank you all for inviting me to speak at your community meeting on an important public health topic, GMOs and their labeling. Over the next few minutes, I'm going to talk about what GMOs are, why they are used, common myths, and pros and cons of using GMOs. Then I'll talk about how GMOs are regulated in the United States. We will also discuss the history and current labeling policies, the non-GMO project, public opinion on GMOs, and the pros and cons of labeling GMO products. First, let's talk about what GMOs are. GMO stands for genetically modified organism, which is an organism with DNA that has been changed in some way. This may sound alarming. However, we've been selecting genetic traits and changing DNA for centuries through selecting the best crops to replant and through the domestication of animals. On the left, you'll see a picture of a wild wolf, which you probably wouldn't want lying on your couch. On the right is a picture of my dog, Lila, who is cuddly and sweet and very genetically distinct from her ancestral predecessor, the wolf. GMOs are simply a more targeted way of selecting desirable traits. This is done by inserting a single gene with a known trait into the DNA of a cell. That cell is then cultured until it grows into a plant. Every cell of that plant will have the genetic modification in its genome. Now that you know the basics of what GMOs are and how they are produced, let's discuss why they're important in the first place. Farmers will tell you that the three things that prevent a good crop are insects, weeds, and weather. GM crops can be modified to repel insects. This is achieved by inserting a gene that causes the crop to produce a protein that repels the pest that normally eats it, without harming other insects, animals, or humans. This drastically reduces the amount of chemical pesticides that are necessary to keep crops from being eaten by insects before they are harvested. In addition, GM crops can be modified to be resistant to herbicides. This way, farmers can use a less toxic herbicide, glyphosate, in their fields. These modifications are beneficial to the agricultural industry because they increase the crop yield. GMOs are not just in crops. Other uses of GMOs include the production of medicines and vaccines. This is important because it reduces the need for blood products, animal products, or cadavers to produce the components of these drugs. Reducing the needs for these products in turn reduces the risk of disease transmission, inconsistent quality, contamination, and unreliable supply. For example, insulin is genetically modified. In the past, it was necessary to take insulin from the pancreas of pigs and cows and then purify it for medicinal use. However, now we are able to make synthetic human insulin through the modification of genes. There are three classifications of GMOs. First-generation GMOs are tolerant to herbicides, resistant to pests, and resistant to environmental conditions. In the U.S., the majority of GMOs fall into the category of first generation. Second-generation GMOs have improved nutritional quality. These include high lysine corn, high oleic acid soybean oil, and improved fatty acid profile soybeans. The third-generation GMOs are used for pharmaceuticals, such as synthetic human insulin. Let's talk about some common myths you may have heard about GMOs. The first is that they are not safe. GMOs have actually been studied more than any other group of plants that we consume and have been found time and time again to be safe for human consumption. That leads us to the next myth, that GMOs cause human health problems. In fact, in the almost 30 years that GMOs have been produced in the United States, there have been no documented occurrences of health issues related to GMO consumption or use. Some people say that GMO research cannot be trusted because it's funded by big agriculture or big pharma, and those companies are just trying to trick us and make money. But GMOs have actually been tested by independent third-party scientists who have no conflicts of interest. Finally, the myth that I probably hear the most is that GMO crops cause overuse of pesticides and herbicides. The opposite is actually true, as we already discussed. GMO crops reduce the need for pesticides because they are genetically engineered to repel pests themselves. Herbicide-resistant or Roundup-ready crops reduce the use of toxic herbicides because they are made to be resistant to an herbicide that is extremely safe and environmentally friendly. Now let's get into some of the pros and cons of GMO use. We've already gone over many of these. Some of the pros of GMO use include the reduced use of pesticides, the use of safer herbicides, the potential for increasing the nutritional value of crops, which would be beneficial for parts of the world where hunger and starvation are major issues. GMO crops can be made to be disease and drought resistant, which would increase the worldwide food supply. Additionally, higher crop yield for farmers means cheaper produce for consumers. In addition, GMO crops may have longer shelf lives than conventional produce. Finally, as we already discussed, GMOs are not only crops, but can also be used for medicinal purposes, such as producing human insulin. However, no good thing is without potential downsides. There is a legitimate concern for pest resistance to GMOs. That is, insects could evolve to be resistant to the genetically modified protein made by GMOs to repel those pests. In the same way, weeds could become resistant to glyphosate, the herbicide used with GMOs, rendering it less useful. However, these considerations can be avoided with judicial use of pesticides and herbicides. In addition, even though GM crops have been tested and deemed safe as conventional crops, they have only been around for 30 years, so we don't have any studies yet that follow them over the lifetime of individuals. Finally, and probably the biggest con to GMO use, is public distrust of GMO technology. GMOs are strictly regulated in the U.S., as are all food products. There are three main organizations that regulate GMOs. First, the USDA Animals and Plant Health Inspection Service protects animals and agriculture from pest and disease, regulates biotechnology products like GMOs, and regulates any products known or suspected to pose a risk to human health. The EPA is in charge of the sale, distribution, and use of all pesticides, and it also sets the tolerance limits for pesticide residues on and in food and animal feed. Finally, the FDA regulates the safety and labeling of all plant-derived food and feed. The FDA states that foods derived from genetically engineered plants must meet the same safety, labeling, and regulatory requirements that apply to all foods regulated by the FDA. This means that according to federal law, GMO foods must demonstrate the same quality and safety level as conventionally grown crops. Now, let's review the history of GMO labeling. When GMOs were introduced in the mid-1990s, no labeling was required because the FDA determined that there was no noticeable difference in nutrition or safety from other food products. However, the European Union banned GMOs from the U.S. This is where some of the public distrust began to grow, because some thought that the EU banned GMOs because they were unsafe. However, the actual reason that U.S. GMOs were banned from the EU was because they wanted to limit the import of all U.S. agriculture. Still, over the recent years, public has advocated for more information about GMOs. So in 2016, Congress passed the National Bioengineered Food Disclosure Standard, which established a federal standard for labeling foods made with GMOs. What this did, essentially, was to require labels for any foods derived from a genetically modified source that had material changes from the conventional crop. For example, foods with changed nutrition, such as high oleic soybean oil, must be labeled because it has higher levels of oleic acid than conventional soybean oil. This does not necessarily mean that it is less safe, because as we already stated, the FDA requires that all GM foods be held to the same safety standards as all foods. However, it just points out that there is a difference in this particular GMO. I'm sure that many of you have seen the non-GMO Project Verified label throughout your local grocery stores. I definitely have. Let's talk a little bit about what that means. First of all, GMO-free labels are prohibited by the federal government. This is due to the fact that there is no way to test for low-level presence of genetically modified ingredients in any food products. Therefore, there can be no identified threshold below which a food product can be considered GMO-free. Therefore, non-GMO Project Verified does not indicate that a food is GM-free. All it means is that this produce contains no more than 0.9% GM ingredients. In addition, non-GMO labels do not imply that the food is higher quality than GM foods. As we already discussed, genetically modified foods are held to the same standards of quality and safety as all food products tested by the FDA. Finally, non-GMO labels can be very misleading. I've seen these labels on products that by definition cannot be genetically modified. For example, the United States does not produce any genetically modified tomatoes. Therefore, putting non-GMO verified on a can of tomatoes is misleading because it implies that there is a choice between GMO and non-GMO tomatoes. I've also seen these labels on things like bottles of water. Water does not have any genetic material and therefore cannot by definition be genetically modified. So the label itself is designed to mislead your understanding on what a GMO is. The court of public opinion is always very strong and polarizing, especially when it comes to GMOs. Many people have strong opinions about GMOs despite little understanding of the science behind GMO products. This may simply indicate that people are uncertain of the GM technology rather than unsure about the products themselves. People tend to fear what they do not understand, and a Rutgers University study showed that 54% of respondents said they knew little or nothing about GMOs, and an additional 25% had not even heard of GMOs. Many people have little or no knowledge about GMOs and are being informed by the internet and social media for information. As we all know, these sources may be inaccurate, incomplete, or misleading. This is demonstrated by studies that have shown that consumers believe that food labeled GMO are less healthy, safe, and environmentally friendly compared to non-GMO food. This means that the GMO label may be scaring people into thinking GMOs are bad when the scientific consensus is that they are safe. This brings us to our final point about the pros and cons of GMO labeling. The arguments for GMO labeling definitely have merit. First of all, consumers have a right to know what is in their food so that they can decide what to purchase. This is an ethical practice of transparency. In addition, other countries do label GMOs, so there is worldwide precedence to do it. Finally, if there ever were to be some kind of health or environmental issue that were linked to GMO use, labeling could improve tracing and recall of those products for scientific study. On the other hand, GMO labeling, as we already discussed, can lead to public scrutiny and fear. It may mislead consumers who think that a GMO label is like a warning label, and the consumer may consider the product to be unsafe. In addition, organic food is already labeled, so there may be undue burden in having farmers increase their costs to label GMO food. Finally, GMO labeling is a hot political issue. Lobbyists love to hate GMOs and can use their arguments against them as fuel for other political agendas. Just to recap, GMOs are organisms that have had their DNA slightly modified to produce a desirable trait, such as pest resistance. GMOs reduce the need for harmful pesticides and herbicides. However, there are legitimate concerns for pest or weed resistance to GMOs. GMOs are highly regulated by the U.S. government and are held to the exact same quality and safety standard as conventional crops. Currently, all GM foods that have a component change must be labeled, such as high oleic acid soybean oil. As we discussed, non-GMO labels may be misleading. However, the public has a right to know what is in the product that they purchase. Ultimately, it is up to you as a consumer to make an informed decision for yourself and your family as to whether you choose to support GMO production, sales, and labeling. I'd like to thank you all for your time today. If you would like to learn more about the topic that we've discussed, please refer to the following references.